It looks like pretty much everyone is back, and our next talk, the last block of talks for today, is going to be led by Ryan Lynch. Ryan is a scientist here at the Green Bank Observatory and an expert on pulsars. He's also leading a few other projects at the observatory, and today he'll be running us through how to submit a GBT proposal. Take it away, Ryan.
Cool, thanks. Okay, so as usual, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, or I'm perfectly fine for people to just interrupt me and unmute yourself, but I'm not going to be able to see the questions while presenting. So I assume someone else will let me know if there are any. So the purpose of this talk is to kind of introduce you to how to actually submit a GBT proposal, and as well to give you some tips on things you can do to increase your chances of that proposal being successfully awarded telescope time. So we have time at the end. I'll actually step through some of the online tools that are used to put a proposal together so you can see them. It's all done through the NRAO and GBO proposal submission tool. So if you're already familiar with submitting proposals to NRAO, there's differences based on telescope, but a lot of commonalities too. Okay, so just some things to think about. You have interesting idea for a cool science project that you think the GBT would be well suited for. Where do you go from there? So one thing to start with is to read the most recent call for proposals in detail. These come out twice a year, although you can submit proposals at any time. We'll get into the different types of proposals and when they will actually be considered. But the proposal call has information that is important in terms of the types of receivers and backend instruments that might be available, as well as any kind of special considerations or constraints that you might want to consider for the current proposing or observing semester, or the one that you'll be submitting for. There are also sometimes unique opportunities there. For example, we may be commissioning a new instrument, and there may be some time available for shared risk observing that you may want to take advantage of. So as you're thinking about how to put a proposal together, these are pretty standard kinds of things that you ought to think about for any telescope. But you need to convince a reviewer that the proposal is actually worth doing. So you want to make the case that this is worthy and high impact science, and that it will be successful in some degree. Think about whether or not the project has been done before. You may want to observe the same source to look for the same spectral lines or new pulsar that someone else has done in the past. But you're going to do that, make a case for why it's different. Why is the GBT the right telescope to use? It's not the only radio telescope in the world. So why is its capabilities best suited to your science? And what do you actually need in terms of things like bandwidth, in terms of integration time, in terms of reaching a particular sensitivity, in order to meet your scientific goals? More time is always going to be better. More sensitivity is always going to be better, but there's not an infinite amount of resources available. So you want to ensure that you're going to be able to achieve your science goals, but not go so far beyond that the time you need is no longer well justified. So there are a few different proposal categories that you can submit to the GBT. Two of them are regular proposals. These are just kind of the standard proposal that are the most common that we get. They have certain definitions, primarily based around the number of hours that are being requested in total, or the duration of the proposal, how long it's actually going to remain active and schedulable. And I'm not going to go through all the details here. You can read them off, but those different constraints are based upon primarily the frequency that you're observing at and what kind of weather condition you would need, but also whether or not you need things like fixed observing time. Large proposals are basically proposals that exceed those categories, those limits, and not limits, but those thresholds for the total number of hours or the duration that the project would run for. There are also triggered proposals. these are submitted at the normal proposal deadline. So they're not submitted anytime you find something new and interesting. There is a way to do that, but that's not what triggered proposals are. They are intended for observations that you can plan in advance, but that need to be scheduled based upon some sort of criteria that you can't necessarily predict ahead of time. So for example, you might want to observe a fast radio burst during its period of higher activity that is determined by some other telescope which is doing monitoring, or perhaps by the detection of an X-ray counterpart. You may know that that is likely to happen, and you may have very specific criteria for when you would use the GBT, but you don't know exactly when it's going to happen. And so a triggered proposal defines those criteria under which the proposal would be scheduled very clearly, but is submitted well in advance, so you're not scrambling at the last minute to put something together. There are also director's discretionary time proposals. There's a limited amount of time available for these throughout any given semester. I don't actually know exactly how much time is set aside. I suspect it varies from semester to semester. And there are kind of two subcategories within director's discretionary time. One is called target of opportunity. And this is kind of like a triggered proposal, but for something you could not have predicted well in advance. So, a great example of this would have been the repeating fast radio burst when it was first found. It wasn't expected, but everyone wanted to start observing it with all the radio telescopes that they could. So this is something that's unexpected and when you need a quick response. Another good example of that was when a new comet was found. You couldn't predict that in advance, but people want to observe it with the GBT for particular mission lines, perhaps. And so that's another good example. There are also exploratory time proposals. And these are meant to be small projects where maybe you had an idea, but it's using a new observing technique, or it's a little bit borderline exactly what kind of larger time request you might need for a full-scale project. And you can submit these and kind of do a small pilot project, particularly if you're trying to take advantage of some new idea or new capability. And again, before you submit a larger proposal, whether that's a regular or officially large proposal, you want to just use a small amount of time. Exploratory time proposals are typically just a few hours, maybe they're granted. So it would be rare if you got more than say 10 hours. It's perhaps not unheard of, but you'd have to make a pretty good case. So again, they're not intended for like a full-fledged observing program, but something which is new and interesting to try out. So just some statistics on the number of proposals that we get. The numbers vary from semester to semester, but typically we review somewhere between 300 and 500 proposals. And the majority of those are pretty good and roughly equal. We're all fairly well-educated and creative scientists, so you would expect most of the proposals to be pretty good. And so you need to differentiate yourself from those large numbers of proposals in order to make sure that you have a ranked score which is high enough to actually achieve time. So what are some tips for doing that? Well, first, let's just make sure we understand what all goes into a proposal. There will be an abstract on the cover page. It's pretty small. It's just basically a paragraph, so it's limited to 200 words. You'll be providing typically introductory and background information for the reviewers, and then a description of the project and why you want to do it scientifically. And those are going to go into what we call scientific justification. The introduction, the description, and the science justification. We call that all the science justification part of the proposal. And again, that's really your opportunity to convince a reviewer that this is interesting and going to be high impact science that's worth doing. The technical justification and the time request are entered in a different part of the proposal submission tool. You actually have as much space as you need to enter a technical justification, and there are pre-defined questions that we ask you so that we know we have the information in order to determine the technical feasibility. So you do not need to go into detail on that in the scientific justification of the proposal. A lot of people do, and that's not really the best use of this limited space you have for the scientific justification. So keep that in mind. We will know what you want to do from a technical perspective, even if you don't spell it out in detail. You should say something, but it could just be a couple sentences. So some tips for the scientific justification. These are just things that Tony has put together. Be thorough but concise. Provide enough introductory material to make sure that the reader has a good understanding of the context for the project. Discuss the impact of a successful proposal, and very importantly, discuss the potential impact of a null result. You may not necessarily know if you're going to detect something, depending on the type of project you're doing. That can still be useful, but make sure that the referees know that that will still have value, even if you don't necessarily make the kind of detection that you might anticipate. The review panels are broken into general science categories, but you should not assume that there will always be an expert in your particular scientific field on that panel. And you certainly should not assume that all of the reviewers are going to be an expert in your particular area of specialization. So make it understandable for a well-educated radio astronomer, but someone who may not necessarily be extremely well versed in what you want to do. So yeah, don't just try and throw science words at them. Use figures. These are all pretty standard recommendations. On the technical justification, this is very important. So make sure you understand what the GBT is currently capable of doing. New instruments come online. Sometimes old instruments are retired or may not be available in a particular semester. So make sure that you understand what is actually possible to do from a technical perspective. If you have any questions, always reach out to an observatory staff member. And you know us now, so that'll be easier for you to do. We have, like I said, a predefined form that I'll show you in a little bit that prompts the particular types of information that we want for the technical justification. So fill that out completely. Sometimes things will not apply to your particular science area. So for example, we ask for some information for pulsar projects. Obviously, that's not going to apply to an ammonia mapping experiment. And that's okay, just say not applicable. But if it is applicable, make sure that you fill all that information out completely. And wherever possible, use the observatory provided tools for things like sensitivity calculations. Also, we do an independent review of all the time requests. So we will, as technical reviewers, we do not opine on the scientific merit of your proposal, but we will say, okay, they said they need to reach this sensitivity, and they requested double the time that they actually needed to do it. So if you are going to grant this project time, you should reduce it based upon what they asked. We will catch that and we will make that recommendation to the time allocation committee. So you ask what you need, but not more. Just a few stylistic considerations. So the abstract will be shown on the cover sheet of the proposal. You do not need to reproduce it in the scientific justification. A lot of people do this. And again, it's not the best use of the time, or the space rather, that you have. That is also true for the technical justification, as I already said. I have the page limits on here and other formatting guidelines. So for regular proposals, the limit is 4 pages. That's also true for triggered and DDT proposals. For large proposals, the limit is 10 pages, and there is some extra information that is required. And this includes any figures, tables, and your reference list. So you don't get extra space for those. So don't go over the page limits, but don't feel like you have to pad the proposal to meet them either. Also, the minimum font size is 11 point for the main text. If you want to use a smaller text size for things like footnotes and figure captions, that's okay, but they have to be legible, so don't make them too tiny. Then there's 1-inch margins, all that kind of stuff is standard. And remember that your referee is going to read a lot of proposals, so you need to write well, standard stuff. So when the proposals actually due, so you can submit a proposal at any time. And then for DDT and exploratory time proposals, However, we have 2 fixed deadlines where most of our proposals come in. They're on August 1st and February 1st. So we just had one pass a little while ago. The August deadline is for the winter observing season, mostly. That's actually not entirely true because we kind of split it up. So it's from February to July, what we call our A semester. And then the February deadline is from August to January, which is what we call the B semester. You should be aware that we have agreements with other observatories where we actually allow the time allocation review committees for those observatories to actually grant time on the GBT for joint projects. And this can actually be a really nice way to get some complementary GBT data to go along with data from at other wavebands. So those are the observatories that we currently have those agreements with. So if your science can make use of those observatories and the GBT, that's a great thing to take advantage of. We also have something called filler time proposals. So there will be periods in the GBT schedule where we may not be able to schedule a project that we had planned to. Maybe the weather takes a turn for the worst, and we're not able to schedule the high frequency time that we thought that we're going to be able to. It may be that there's some small gaps in the schedule where it's hard to like fit a project in, and things like that. So you can actually submit a proposal that is designated as filler time. It's not guaranteed to get time, but it will be slotted in on short notice and can be operator run with appropriate preparation by the observing team. And this can be a really nice way to get time for, let's say, like a large H1 survey or a pulsar survey. And when you designate that as filler time proposal, it automatically receives a C ranking, which we'll get into. And so the bar to cross is a little bit lower than it might be for other types of proposal categories. So think about something like that. It's not obviously well suited for all types of observing projects, but it helps the GBT to fill out those types of little gaps in the schedule. And it could be a nice way to get a decent amount of time. There are 8 different review panels. You can always volunteer for them if you are interested in doing so. We always appreciate that. And I'm not going to remember what they all are off the top of my head. I probably should. I apologize for not listing that in here, but we'll show them when I go over into the proposal submission tool. So choose the one that's best suited for your science, but just be aware that you may have some non-experts. So how does the proposal ranking actually happen? It's kind of weird because you get like a reverse score. There's a whole normalization process. You can read details about it on the NREO websites if you're really interested in all the logic behind it. But 0 is actually the best score you can get, and 10 is the worst. So just be aware of that when you actually see your grades. And then the proposals are basically rank ordered. And then the director, the head of science operations, and the time allocation committee get together and figure out, given the requests at different LST ranges, different weather conditions, et cetera, where the cutoffs should be for different grades. A-ranked proposals are the top. These are active for a full year, so 2 semesters. And the expectation is that you will get all of your time. There may be some extraordinary circumstances where that won't be the case, but A-ranked proposals are accepted with the understanding that there should be, under foreseeable circumstances, enough time to actually complete the project. B-ranked proposals are only active for 1 semester. It's still expected you'll get most of the time, but you may not get all of it in that case. So it has lower priority. If we get through all the A-ranked proposals, then we'll move on to the B-ranked proposals. It's not sequential like that. It depends on LST range, weather conditions, etc. But you're not necessarily guaranteed. C-ranked proposals are only active for 1 semester, and they're basically filler time, whether you designated it that way or not. But you can make the choice to designate it as a filler project. And you might get some time with C-ranked proposals. And again, depending upon the constraints you have Some C-rank proposals are more likely to get their time than others. And then N is just not accepted, so it's not going to be considered for scheduling. Yeah, I think these are all fairly standard things. Technical justification, follow all the prompts. Make sure that you take into account overhead times. If you're doing pointing and focusing scans, depending upon the frequency that you're observing at and the weather conditions, you may need to do this pretty frequently. So be aware of that. I think 2 hours at low frequencies, you can get away with it, doing it less often than every 2 hours. On the OOF, if you are going to require that, take into account the overheads associated with that. Think about scan latencies, so the time it takes to move between sources. If you're observing a lot of different positions on the sky, depending on how close they are, it might only take half a minute, but it could take a few minutes to move the telescope. And there are latencies with configuring, balancing, et cetera, et cetera. So it takes tens of seconds to start a scan. So just be aware of that. You're not going to probably be planning your observing session down to the 30-second level. But if you are observing a lot of sources, it could add 15 minutes of overhead, maybe even more, depending on how you're slewing, how many times you're slewing. So just be aware of that when you're thinking about the overhead fractions. Some common mistakes. So the confusion limit, if you can't resolve out background sources, then you reach a point at which your lack of knowledge about the background sources becomes a limiting factor. If you have higher resolution data you compare with your GBT observations, then there are ways to get around that, but be aware of it. 1/f noise, this is basically gain variations. So we call it 1/f noise because it has kind of a low frequency pink noise kind of structure. So these are receiver dependent, and your project friends or people at the observatory can help you figure this out. It's really most relevant for like continuum projects, broadband projects, when the product of bandwidth and the integration time exceeds certain limits. Radio frequency interference, something you've heard us talk about a lot. Some frequency ranges are pretty clean. Others have a lot of known transmission. We saw last night in my group a lot of L-band RFI. That's satellite transmissions that we can't generally do much about. Be aware of it and have a plan for dealing with it. And then use the sensitivity calculator and the mapping calculator as appropriate to figure out your time requests and mapping strategies. There are links there. Okay, so the GBT schedule is broken into different observing sessions. When you submit a proposal, you will choose a front-end receiver and a back-end that you want to pair together for your observation. And then you'll also pair that up with a source group, so a particular set of sources that you want to observe. And that combination of a set of resources and a set of sources is what we call a session. And that's what is actually going to get scheduled on the telescope if the proposal is active. So if you need multiple receivers within the same session for some reason, then make sure you pair them together in the proposal submission tool. If they can be scheduled independently from each other, break them into separate sessions. You should group sources together that are close on the sky, pretty standard. You don't want to observe one source when it's transiting and then try to observe another source on the opposite part of the sky when it's set. By default, to calculate the schedulable LST ranges, the proposal submission tool uses the average position of all the sources within a particular group. So don't space your sources out too far. And if you need to specify different LST ranges, you can do that. Some other tips there on how to group them. You can use the scheduler in Skyview as well before you submit a proposal to kind of help plan that out. And don't restrict your observable LST range too much, because the more flexibility you have, the easier it is to schedule you. So the GBT is typically oversubscribed by a factor of, I think, usually about 3. Not sure if Tony's on, he would know off the top of his head. But that does depend on LST. So when the galactic center is up, not surprisingly, that's more oversubscribed. So if you have if you have science that can be done at different LST ranges, if you're observing a representative sample of galaxies or quasars looking for like statistical information about the population, and you can get that by observing sources at undersubscribed LST ranges, you should do that. So go for the lowest hanging fruit. This is a really important point. Fixed projects are becoming more difficult to schedule. So what do we mean by fixed projects? These are projects that require a very specific date and time that they need to be scheduled on, or that require a very particular kind of cadence to the observations once they start. This is often true for certain types of pulsar observing projects and VLBI observing projects. Let's say you're trying to observe a system to measure parallax with the high sensitivity array. So you need to schedule with other telescopes in the array, as well as at particular times of the year. And so that just adds more constraints on the schedule. For pulsars, maybe you're trying to observe something at particular orbital phases in the binary pulsar that only occurs at certain times. And the reason these are becoming harder to schedule is because as the fraction of open skies time on the GBT decreases, finding a way to schedule those fixed projects while keeping everything else happy is just a little bit more challenging. So if you need those types of observations, ask for them. Just make sure that you provide a strong justification for them, and recognize that your proposal will have to rank on the higher side for them to be scheduled. Be as flexible as you can be with your scheduling constraints, as long as you can still do the science you need to do, right? That has to come first, but within that, qualification, be as flexible as you can. And make really clear to the reviewers, both the technical reviewers and the scientific reviewers, the must-haves versus the preferred-haves. If you absolutely must observe a particular source at a particular date and time, that's the way it is. But if you have some flexibility in that, just make sure that that's spelled out very clearly. So I think this is the last slide. There's some important websites here. You can bookmark these. All of this is in the PDF, which is available in the shared Google Drive. So don't feel like you need to jot all of this down right now. But what I'd like to do is pause. I think I may have stopped sharing my screen. Let me share it again. What I'd like to do is pause, see if there's any questions, and then actually go into the proposal submission tool. Excuse me, and walk you through a few of these steps. So I'll be quiet here now to see if there's any questions.
I'll mention a couple that were asked in the chat and Tony addressed. One was, is there an agreement in place for joint observations with JWST? And Tony said, not yet. There have been negotiations, but there's nothing concrete. And another is there any time limit suggestion for filler time proposals?
Yeah, no, Tony, do you have any thoughts on that? He's still on.
So he said that there is no hard limit for any proposal, just the boundary between a regular proposal and a large proposal.
Yeah, so I don't have a firm answer to that, but I will say that we get some projects that require a lot of time. So I mean, I'm on several large pulsar surveys that over the course of the last decade, to be fair, have gotten 5,500 hours or close to it of telescope time. Now that's obviously broken up over a long range, but that still averages several hundred hours per year. So it's not impossible to do, but it's not the norm either.
Yeah, we have had several. We have had several large filler projects.
So my question is more about, so what is called a filler project? Because for example, in X-ray observatories for scheduling, I work with NewStar and we kind of take, 15 to 20 kilosecond as being a filler, easily schedulable block. So is there any time limit like this? This might be something that's very easy to schedule in. So, there is a higher likelihood for the proposal to be accepted.
Yes, Tony, feel free to jump in. This GBT is scheduled in 15-minute increments, but more than likely your overhead is going to be more than 15 minutes. So it's probably not going to be efficient to schedule something in that short of a range. But I think that, it's a bit dependent on your overhead fraction. But when you start to get to like 45 minutes, your overhead fraction might be kind of high, but I think that that's starting to get to be, a more useful investment in telescope time. Certainly by the time you get to like an hour or so. Tony, does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, typically we have weird gaps of 1 to 2 hours that need to be filled in that filler projects usually take up. Sometimes those can be much larger gaps at the beginning or end of the semester as people have finished projects or haven't set theirs up to be scheduled yet. But typically in the middle of the semester, it can be 1 to a couple hour gaps.
And also for any of these filler projects, it should be something with a quote unquote easy configuration that can basically be run automatically by the operator in any of those gaps. So they wouldn't call you up and ask you to fill it in. It would just be automatically run.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, we've had a mixed bag. Some people want to be scheduled and control the observations. Others have worked hard to make sure that the operators can run them. So, depends all on what you're trying to do.
Okay.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Not. So my.nreo.edu is where you will go to submit your proposals. You can register for an account if you haven't already. And when you log in, you'll see something like this. You may not have like this reviews tab. I have like some staff member that do technical reviews, but you'll go to proposals. And you'll typically see something like this. If you've never been on a GBT proposal before, you probably won't have a list like this. But this shows all the historical proposals that you've been on. This is actually not just GBT too. This is across all of NREOs. So you can see here's like a VLA proposal. There's some VLBI ones in there for me. Not very many, but maybe 1 or 2. So if you want to submit a new proposal, you click on new proposal. You will choose the primary telescope that you'll be using. So I'll click on GBT here. And then you'll hit create. And then that'll generate a new proposal that for now just has some sort of identifier that looks like this. And you see it's a blank proposal. So this is the cover sheet. This is where you just kind of enter a lot of the general information. So if you click edit here, you'll have an opportunity to put your title in. Here's where you would choose between the category of proposal. If you have a sponsor, then you could choose that from here. So there are contractual agreements between GBO and a few other organizations that they're purchasing a certain fraction of telescope time.
Does that affect the ranking at all of your proposal?
The sponsor?
Right.
Yeah, so if it's sponsored time, then there will have been a prearranged agreement between the sponsor and the observatory for a certain amount of hours. If there are any kinds of special stipulations on the types of projects that can be submitted as part of that contract, they will be in the contract. And so when you submit that, it will still go for a technical review, and it might undergo a review just to make sure there's no conflict with another project. But then it would be scheduled after that. So it doesn't go through the normal review process. So it does affect the ranking in the sense that because it's purchase time, again, once it's checked for technical feasibility and conflicts, it will be scheduled in accordance with the contract. So it doesn't get a ranking like it normally would.
And if the agreement calls for the data to wind up in the data archive, then it does have to go through the proposal submission tool.
Okay. Yeah, so you still have to submit something here potentially. but that might just be mostly for bookkeeping. You can choose your scientific category here. So these are basically the review, the scientific review panel categories. So you choose which one it will go to. You can see what they are here, and there's more detailed information about how you should group or organize your proposal. Choose the one that seems to be the best fit for the science you want to do. Here's abstract entry. Here's where you can put in information about joint proposals. And then there's checkboxes here that you can check off depending on the specifics of the observing type that you want to do. So again, just check all that you think might apply. This helps with technical reviews. And if this is related to past proposals, you can put that information in here. So let's say it's a continuation of a project or follow-up of a pilot project. You can put that information in here, and that could be useful for reviewers. You will not actually enter the time yourself. That will get calculated in another section and filled in automatically.
Brian, I had a quick question.
Yep.
So the dissertation plan thing, I know this doesn't quite apply to me anymore, but I know a lot of people in here are still grad students. How does that affect the ranking of your proposal? I mean, how do reviewers take into account this dissertation plan?
Yeah, so for those who aren't familiar with this, you can associate a student dissertation plan. It's a description of what the dissertation actually is with the proposal. And then that gets tacked on to the review. So reviewers can see that. I think it's fair to say that special effort is made to help students get time for a thesis project. I don't really know in detail how it affects reviews or rankings. Tony, do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, typically the review panels will give boosts to thesis projects. So it's quite important to keep the thesis plan up to date because if they don't see that the proposal is tied to the thesis and you've checked the thesis part of the proposal, then they're not going to be happy with that. But having the plan in there does allow the panel to see how far and the thesis plan has gotten and whether the observations are needed to finish it up or how important they are to the thesis. And that is taken into account when ranking the proposals.
Thanks.
Here's a question. Is an undergrad considered a student author, or does it only apply to graduate students?
Yeah, it's really only meant for graduate students.
So undergraduates can be on proposals as authors, but the thesis plan is for graduate students.
Right. The primary reason there is we want to keep, the students' time being in a postdoctoral position quite while in a graduate school as small as possible. We don't want them to have to wait, 2 years to finally get the proposal through the system if they, trying to reduce that time frame as much as possible.
Okay, I'm going to hit cancel here, but you would normally save after editing things. You enter your authors here. If you want to add an author, they do have to have registered in the system, but you can search on people by first name, last name, etc. Here's Mr. Armentrout. So I'll check him and save. And this is also where you could associate a dissertation plan with a particular observer. So you can check the dissertation plan box and make sure that's then uploaded. Actually, I haven't done this for a while. Jenny, where do you upload the dissertation plan? Is that something that the author does?
I think you put it in your profile. That's what I remember from when I did it. And
yeah, it's been years since I've actually done that. So we can add all your authors there. Make sure that, again, they're registered users. Your science stuff justification gets uploaded here, generally as a PDF. So that would just be a typical file upload. Technical justification. So this is one of the important ones. So you have these free-form text boxes that you can use to fill in information that you are requested to fill in. So this is where it's important to fill in everything. So for example, here's a box for filling in the date and time and the reason for any types of fixed observations. So for example, if you needed to observe a pulsar at a particular orbital phase, you would put that in here, and you might also list the UTC times at which that orbital phase will actually be observable from the GBT. So that's one important thing there. If you don't need any kind of fixed or windowed observations, just say not allowed, don't need it. Sensitivity calculations. This is a really big one. So use the GBT sensitivity calculator. It is your friend. It's not just doing the radiometer equation. I mean, it is on some level, but it takes into account the typical types of observing conditions that you're likely to get for the types of projects that you're requesting based upon things like the observing frequency and what we know about the weather. So it's designed to actually return a value which is appropriate for the known environment and properties and likely conditions that you're going to observe out of the GBT. So I'm just going to put random numbers in here. Just let it do all the defaults. So when you actually fill everything in more carefully, you're going to get output like this. We actually really prefer that you copy and paste this output directly into this part of the justification. You can provide more context. So it doesn't just have to be the output from the sensitivity calculator, but it's really helpful for us if you include that. Now, there may be a really complicated observing setup where you're observing at like, a ton of different frequencies, and it can be a little bit tedious. If you can, still copy and paste all that information in, but if you can provide us with enough information to recreate it and double check things, then that can also be good. Sometimes your observing time request is not motivated by hitting a particular sensitivity limit. So for example, let's say you're observing a transient source and you're hoping to catch it during a period of high activity. But if you want to get, a dozen events, you need to observe for 2 hours, right? You're not trying to hit a particular integrated sensitivity in that case. You're trying to cast a wide net for something which is time variable. So, if a particular sensitivity calculation is not necessarily appropriate for your time, the reason you're making a particular time request, you can explain that, but just make sure it's clear. And you still need to hit a particular signal to noise threshold. So you can still fill in the sensitivity calculator and let your reviewers know for a burst of this flux density, we expect to reach a signal noise of this. So similarly with the mapping calculator, if you fill all this in, I'm just going to let it do the defaults. It will print out something like this, and we ask you basically copy and paste the output here. And do use the mapping calculator, because again, it takes into account things about the GBT that you don't need to worry about, like how quickly you need to worry about it, but you don't have to go through and solve all of these equations by hand. Like how quickly can you accelerate, and how many accelerations can you do in a particular period of time? There are limits on that in order to preserve the integrity of the structure. So use the mapping calculator. Talk about RFI impact and how you plan on handling it. So if there are known sources of RFI, call that out. This doesn't have to be super, super detailed. You can say, we have these standard tools that are available in the community, and we'll use that to automatically and manually flag RFI, and we might expect to lose 5 or 10% of our observing band, but if it's continuum observation, then perhaps that's acceptable. Or you can say, we're observing in at frequency ranges where there are no known sources of RFI, but make sure you address that. Overhead calculations go here. There are guidelines for that. When in doubt, ask your friend or your project friend. Any justification about the use of external facilities, if it's a joint proposal. If you're doing something kind of new and it doesn't seem like it fits into the boxes, tell us about it here, but make sure you provide enough detail that we can assess whether or not it's feasible. We ask for some information about pulsars. If you know it ahead of time, if you don't, because you're like doing a search for new pulsars, you can just say that. And then if you're changing the default LST ranges, just explain why you've done that here. You have unlimited space for these fields. So again, make good use of them and don't repeat what you're putting here in the scientific justification. Make sure you hit save. Your sources are added here. You can copy them and import them from other past observing proposals. So if you have a long list of sources as part of a long running project, you don't have to add them all by hand. But you'll start off by making a source group. That source group could contain just one source, but if it makes sense to group them together, you can. You can actually search then Sinbad for particular sources, which is handy for not having to fill in all of that information. So say, yeah, that's what I wanted to observe. I assume that's all correct. But if you need to, you can also add it by hand, and it's what you would expect. Right ascension, declination, if it's an extended source, over what range does it extend? And then information about the velocity, if you know about it, and that's relevant. You can also choose whether or not this is a calibration source. And if I wanted to create a second source group, I could do that too. I wonder if this works. Let's try this. Oh, no, I wouldn't do this. I don't think Mars is in the extragalactic database. I've never actually tried searching for a planet. Yeah, I didn't think that's going to work. It's worth a try. So there are my two source groups. Resources get added here. So you create a resource group. So I'm now going to add resources to this group. So we'll call this. So let's say I want to use the 800 megahertz receiver, Vegas pulsar. You can choose various parameters here. Not going to go through and do them all right now. Now, if I wanted to observe with the L-band receiver as well, I will add that to the same resource group. So now these will be paired together when you come up with a session, and both receivers would be required to be on the telescope to schedule that session. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. But you can also make a second resource group. So let's say that your project requires the use of multiple receivers, but they don't have to be paired together in the same session. So I can make a new group for that. So now I have two resource groups. And then here's where you build your session. So you click on new session, give it a name. The number of observing sessions that you want to put into this group. So if you want to observe the same sources with the same resource group, say 6 times, then you can put that here. If you have some sort of a separation between observations, let's say I want to observe monthly, you can put that in here. You can change the minimum elevation if you so choose, and then you can select your source group and the resource group that you want to pair. And then you can enter in the number of the hours per session. So let's say I want to observe 2 times per session. 2 hours per session. You put more information in here if you need something freeform. For some reason, I think it requires you to save Then once you have saved, you can go here and update the min-max LST based upon, again, the average rate ascension and declination of that source group. And I can add another session for my second source group. And so on and so forth. Say I need 3 hours per session for this one. So now you see that you have 6 sessions with 2 hours and 1 session by 3 hours. Once all of this is saved, if you come back up here to the cover page, you'll see that it's updated the total time. You should include the overhead fractions in your session length so that this really does reflect the total time request. If you're putting that in the scientific justification, then you probably will at least mention your total time request. Make sure they agree with each other. That's helpful for us so that we don't have to try and figure out where the disconnect is. And that is everything. When you are ready, you would hit submit, or you can validate. It'll automatically validate when you try to submit, and that just basically checks everything has been entered. It's probably not going to validate for me because I don't have a scientific justification and I didn't fill out the cover sheet. So this isn't going to let me submit it right now because I haven't actually filled all that information in, but you would do that. And then you would eventually hit submit when you're ready to do so. And then it goes off and all the wheels turn behind the scenes. And in a few months, you'll get an email telling you whether or not your proposal was accepted. So I made it in an hour. Are there any other questions?
I had a couple quick questions, Ryan.
Mm-hmm.
First, how do the review panels get chosen? And yeah.
So then you can volunteer to be on the review panel, but I've never actually been on the scientific review panel. Tony, can you speak to that?
Yeah, there's a basically the head of the TTA group at NREO goes out and looks at experts in the field and requests whether they will participate as reviewers in the field or in a panel. There are typically 6-ish normal panel members. Some panels have extra members that can fill in if needed, if there's a large number of proposals that come in for whatever reason. And that pool is drawn from knowledge within the observatory, recommendations by the observatory staff, and also from the volunteers that was mentioned.
And TTA stands for telescope time allocation, in case you were curious what that is.
Yeah, and my last question was, there's been a bunch of observatories moving towards these anonymous and dual anonymous proposals. I was wondering if GBT or NRAO in general had any plan to do that too.
Yes, there is a plan to do that, but that's
Tony? We may have lost Tony. I think what he was going to say is, yes, there's a plan to do that, but I think it's still being evaluated and it's not yet been implemented. It's a good question, though.
double blind review process.
We lost you for a bit there, Tony. But I basically said that it's being looked at. If you want to add any more detail.
Well, it's going to be in the new tool when that comes around in a couple of years, but the current tool just can't support it.
Yeah, that's something I need to mention. So you guys are going to spend some time learning how to submit proposals, and then depending on when everything gets finished, there is a redesign of the proposal submission tool that is currently underway. It's not a minor task. It's being led out of NRAO, but some of us were from Rebank were on the committee that kind of helped to define some of the requirements for the new tool set. And I think it's going to really actually be a lot easier to and more intuitive to specify the information that we need to know from you, and it's going to be easier for you to kind of tell us what we need to know too. So I think it's good. I think it's going to be a net improvement, but it is still a couple years out. So things will change on some time scale. The current one has been around for probably like 10 years now, right, Tony?
It's more like 15 and close to
Okay.
20 right now.
Okay, yeah, I'm trying to remember how I submitted my first GBT proposals. I guess it was through this, yeah. Things have changed here and there. All right, any other questions?
There are a couple in the chat. One is, can you import lists of sources from machine readable tables?
So you can import source lists, but I'm not 100% sure on what the,
Yeah.
I've not used that before.
Yes, you can, and it just
There we
requires
go.
a specific formatting for that process. And
Yeah.
example should be shown once this comes up of what the format is. You can see, for example.
Yeah, so source name, group name, coordinate system, equinox, longitude and latitude, reference frame, velocity, convention, the actual velocity, and whether or not it's calibrated. So basically the same information you're filling in here. And it looks like it's just semicolon separated with each source on a separate line.
And another question. Oh, go ahead, Tony.
I was just going to say, just remember, if you ever have a question or concern when creating a proposal, always go ahead and contact the help desk at https://help.nreo.edu.
So that's related to this next question. Is there a project friend available before submitting a proposal?
No, I used that terminology a little bit sloppily. So you will be assigned your official project friend when the proposal is actually accepted for time. However, the staff that you've gotten to know here can also help you to prepare a proposal ahead of time. And if you look on our webpage, you'll see what our backgrounds are and contact information and that kind of thing. So yeah, I was calling us project friends, and that's technically probably not quite accurate, but we can still help you out. We're still your friends.
Those are all the questions in the chat.
I'll just add one thing to that. I mean, that's our job, is to help you. So you do not have to add us to the proposal for us to help you put these things together. So we're providing that as part of our job, as part of the service to our observers. So I just want to make that clear. You may ask people to join the project if you so choose, but you're under absolutely no obligation to do so. And we will help you no matter what, because we want to see the best science get done.
All right, hearing no questions, thank you very much,
Yep.
Ryan.